Today is our last day covering World War II, and the first thing we're going to talk about today is the impact of World War II. The events of this war still impact us today, and it certainly determined the trajectory of events for the 50 years or so afterwards. And before World War II, really the first thing to talk about is how it changed America. So America's military before the war was 17th largest in the world. And when you think of the United States, you don't think of that small of a military, because after World War II, just a few years afterwards, America was the #1 military in the world, and it has been ever since. In fact, the United States spends more on our military than the next 25 countries combined. We are by far the #1 military in the world, and we have been ever since the end of World War II. But before that, we weren't even close to being #1. So it very much transformed America, and especially our emphasis on the military. Also, after the war ended, the Allies really showed that they had learned from history in how they treated the Axis powers that they just defeated. So remember, after World War I, the Allies punished Germany. They blamed Germany for everything, made them pay war reparations, took away their land, reduced the size of their military, etc., etc. And that turned out very badly, because that put the Germans in a position where they were so oppressed that they were desperate enough to turn to somebody like Hitler, and that caused World War II to happen. So the Allies said, let's learn from history, let's try to not repeat the mistakes of the past, and instead of punishing Germany, and instead of punishing Japan like we did with Germany after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles, let's actually help Germany rebuild. Let's help Japan rebuild their nations and become the democracies that they are today. So Germany and Japan are very close allies of the United States, very strong democracies in the world. And a big reason for that is because of how the United States helped them to rebuild. They're two of the richest and most powerful countries in the world today, but they are not against us. They're not enacting evil like they used to do, because of the way we transformed those societies. All right, so the Allies after World War II did a much better job in the post-war world than they did after World War I. Okay, and because of this, there has been no World War III. Now, these post-war actions were outlined in something called the Atlantic Charter of 1941, way back when the war was first starting. And the significance of the Atlantic Charter was that it upheld the rights of free trade and choice of government. It was very similar to Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech, but this one was given by Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. They signed this Atlantic Charter, 8 measures that they agreed upon before Pearl Harbor. And at this point, we knew that we wanted to end this war differently than we did World War I, and so these actions are outlined in the Atlantic Charter. Now, after World War II, the U.S. was able to adjust its economy from wartime to peacetime much better than places like Britain and France and Russia and Germany, because the U.S. had suffered no widespread wartime destruction. Really, the only time we had any wartime destruction was Pearl Harbor. So aside from that, which happened early on in the war, we didn't have any wartime destruction that we had to repair. Therefore, we were able to spend our money on helping other countries recover, and did a phenomenal job at that. The experiences of minorities, especially African Americans who served in the U.S. military during World War II, led to their increased efforts to end racial discrimination and injustice afterwards, because so many of them were given new opportunities in World War II, because we needed everyone we could to win this war. Therefore, they were given job opportunities they didn't usually have, were promoted to ranks in the military they previously had not been able to aspire towards. And now that the war is over, they said, let's try to keep this going. This is our moment. We've proven ourselves to be worthy of equality in both of these world wars. Now is the time to fight to end racial discrimination and injustice. And this resulted in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, which we will be talking about next unit. There were a lot of major results of World War II. Three major results is, number one, the arms race started. Here you have a political cartoon with John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, who were the leaders of the U.S. and the USSR, respectively, in the early 1960s. And the arms race basically meant we tried to stockpile as many nuclear weapons as we could, so that we would have more than Russia. And Russia tried to do the same thing so that they had more nuclear missiles than us. And right after World War II, right after we dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, Russia basically said, I want that. I want that too. That way I can be as powerful as the United States. So Russia started amassing nuclear power, eventually achieved nuclear power of their own, and stockpiled weapons like we were doing. So the arms race began after World War II. Also, the Cold War started, which is what we'll talk about in bulk next unit. And this was mostly about communism versus democracy and free enterprise. Here it's mainly against the USSR and the United States, whereas during the World War II, we were allies, but afterwards we were enemies because now Hitler is defeated, and we now see that Stalin is the major threat in the world. And the two superpowers that emerged, as I said, were the United States and the Soviet Union. The US was the most powerful military, most powerful country in the world in 1945, coming out of the war, but the USSR is a close second, right? So they are people to keep an eye on. And these remained the only two superpowers in the world. The US and Russia remained the only two superpowers in the world until the Soviet Union fell in 1991. We're going to be talking a lot about the Cold War, a lot about the Soviet Union and their relationship with the US in units to come. So the US and the Soviet Union were enemies after World War II for a couple of reasons. First off, the USSR was a communist nation and the US was democratic. Obviously, those two ideologies are very in conflict with each other. So this issue of freedom is really what divided America and Russia. America, being a constitutional republic, believed in giving, and still believes in giving, individual freedom to its citizens, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, etc., and Russia did not believe in any of those things. Remember what Russia was like under Stalin, how he took control of absolutely everything, and everyone's lives were made less free and worse. So because of that difference in ideology and actions, America wanted to spread democracy around the world, the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism around the world. And since there's not much common ground in those two ideologies, the USSR and the US became fierce enemies. Now, half of Europe, going back to 1945, half of Europe was liberated from the Nazi control by America and her allies. Places like Great Britain and France helped to liberate this half of Europe, all these countries in the blue that had been taken over by the Nazis. And the other half, these countries in the red, were liberated from the Nazis by the Soviet Union. We went inward as they also went inward from the other direction, and we pretty much liberated half the continent while the Soviets liberated the other half. Now, after the war, the United States left the Western European nations that they had liberated, allowed them to create their own democratic governments, but Russia stayed. The Russians stayed in these Eastern European countries that they had, quote, liberated, and they established communist governments in these countries, all right? So if you look at these countries in red here, think about how unfortunate they were, all right? So take Poland, for example. Poland was invaded by the Nazis, was occupied by the Nazis for 6 years. Think of all the concentration camps that were in Poland and how many millions of Polish people died, 16% of Poland's population. And then finally, to end the war, Russia comes in and, quote, liberates this whole area, but then they stay. And now Poland is a communist nation under the control of Stalin and other communist Soviet dictators after he died. So Poland specifically calls World War II the war they lost twice, because for Eastern Europe, yes, while the Nazis are defeated, the Soviets not only are not defeated, they are very powerful in your country and are kind of controlling your government. So life was not good for people in Eastern Europe after World War II because of who defeated the Nazis in their country and the fact that the Soviet Union stayed afterwards. Now, on March 5th, 1946, Winston Churchill made a speech at a college in Missouri, and he said about post-war Europe that an iron curtain has descended across the continent, an iron curtain. And by this he meant that Europe had become divided between communist countries in the East, all right, countries that had been freed by the Soviet Union, and the free countries in the West, the countries that had been freed by America and Britain. And he said that the citizens of these communist countries could not cross the border into Western Europe, and that was completely true. They were not allowed to leave their countries, and this was symbolized most tangibly by the Berlin Wall that was erected in Berlin that said you cannot move to this free side of Berlin if you live in the communist Soviet zone. So by Churchill saying that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, he was entirely right. Europe was completely divided from the east to the west. Germany itself was divided, not just Europe as a whole, but since Germany specifically had been half liberated by the Americans and half liberated by the Soviets, Germany itself was divided into two different countries. West Germany was a democracy established by the Americans and the British and the French. And then East Germany became communist, ruled and dominated by the Soviets. Another country that was divided after the war was Korea. So Korea had been taken over by Japan during their conquest throughout the 1920s and 30s. And when the Japanese surrendered, remember both the Soviet Union and the United States were active in this theater. While America was the one to get them to surrender, we got to decide the future of Japan, but that does not mean that we got to decide the future of all of their other territories, including Korea. So Korea was divided. The northern half of Korea was put under Russian control, and surprise, they made it communist. And southern Korea became a free democracy that was established by the United States. This is going to become very important next unit because this is what led to the Korean War. And then finally, as we get to the end of the impact of World War II here, leading up to the next unit, on August 29, 1949, Russia acquired an atomic bomb. Like I said, right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Russia said, I want that, and immediately started working on their own atomic bomb project, kind of like our Manhattan Project. And over the next 4 years, they continued to try to get this same technology so that they could be as powerful as the United States. And finally, they did in 1949, making Russia the second country in the world with a nuclear weapon. Here's a picture of one of the scientists who worked on the first Russian nuke, and here's a picture of the first Russian nuclear tests. All right, so going into the 1950s, now the United States is not the only country with nuclear power. Now Russia also has nuclear power, and we do not like them. So going into the 1950s, you have a very tense time that we call the Cold War going into the 1950s and beyond between the Soviet Union and the United States because we both have nuclear weapons and we do not like each other. All right, so next we're going to very quickly talk about the Nuremberg trials and what happened to some of the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese after the war, and then we will be finished with this unit. All right, so let me know if you have any questions.